Authentic Aloud. Okay. Ilana, first, maybe I can just ask you about, for those who may have not read the book, why did you start learning Daf Yomi and what did it mean to you?
So I started learning Daf Yomi really as a coping mechanism during a really difficult time in my life when had just gotten divorced after a very brief first marriage. I was living alone in Jerusalem, where I had come when I'd gotten married, and sort of struggling to find my footing, feeling like my life had been completely unmoored, and sort of searching for some sense of stability and connectedness. And a friend at the time casually mentioned to me that she'd begun learning Daf Yomi, this program to learn a page of Talmud a day, where Jews all over the world are learning the same page of Talmud a day. And when you do that, you complete the whole Talmud in 7.5 years. And I thought to myself, oh, that would be really helpful to sort of have to commit to something like that. And I just decided on a whim, maybe I would start with the next tractate, this volume of Talmud is known, start learning the next Masechet, and sort of see how it went. And I found myself very quickly, very deeply absorbed in what I was learning and very struck by the connections between what I was learning and what I was experiencing in my life. Actually, the first Masechet I learned was Yoma. Yoma is Aramaic for Hayom, the day, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, which is fast approaching, less than a week away. And I began learning Masechet Yoma at a time when I was still very much grieving, feeling very alone. And much of the Masechet, the 7 of the 8 chapters of the tractate follow in the footsteps of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur, as the high priest goes through all the ritual activities of the day. And it's a very awe-inspiring day, and a very lonely day for the high priest. He does much of this alone, especially when he enters into the Holy of Holies at this holiest moment of the year and the holiest place, in the world for the Jewish people. And I really found myself identifying with his sense of trepidation, with his loneliness. And this sort of continued for me. As I went through all the tractates of the Talmud, I sort of kept feeling like the text was very much resonating with my life. And I found also that I was very much, all of a sudden, I realized that coming from a place where I was feeling very, very alone, didn't really know many people. I came to Israel. I didn't make Aliyah, just came. I thought it would be short term, not knowing anyone, really didn't have much of a community. But when you're learning a page of Talmud and the whole world, the whole Daf Yomi world is learning that same page of Talmud, you sort of become part of this virtual community. And I realized every day when I was learning, even when I was learning alone in my apartment, I was essentially inhabiting this enormous virtual classroom in which sitting in front of me were rows and rows of scholars who'd studied this text in generations before me. And further along in the row where I was sitting, kivyachol, so to speak, there were other students of Talmud elsewhere in Jerusalem, in Bnei Brak, in London, in Houston, all around the world, who were also learning that same page of Talmud. And I had essentially joined what I've come to think of as the world's largest book club, which is kind of what I think Daf Yomi really is.
I was going to ask you about that.
And so that's why I stuck with it, I think.
So I did have conversations with some of the people who started Daf Yomi this cycle, which was right before quarantine and everything hit, and they were saying how Daf Yomi rooted them in the schedule of like things being in mayhem.
I definitely feel that way. No, right now, all my kids are home. We're in another lockdown, and it's the sort of thing where, my kids are on my computer all day doing their Zooms, and there's like never, ever, ever a dull moment. Like, I'm lucky if I can take a shower at some point in the day, really, really, there's no downtime. But if I have any time whatsoever, I carry my Gemara, like literally like under my arm, like I'm always like, if I have a second, I'm always trying to just get through the daf. It's the one commitment that I'm not willing to give up. And I find it really, really anchors me that no matter how much in life has been upended, at the end of the day, I want to be able to say, at least I got through the daf. If I have nothing else to show for myself, right? At least this. So I do find it continues to be very, very helpful right now.
Oh boy, I have so many questions about Daf Yomi journey. So you're going through your third cycle now.
Is it my third cycle? Let me think. I think it's the end of my second cycle, I believe. I
Second,
believe it's the very end of my second cycle because I started with
you
Yoma and now
started
we're in
with.
Eruvin. So yeah, it's
Wow.
the end of the end. I didn't start at the beginning. The Talmud doesn't really have a beginning
Right.
because every page of Talmud assumes that you know all the other pages of Talmud. But when you put the Masechtot in order, when you put the tractates in order, generally one starts with brachot. Like one always starts with brachot, generally. But that is to say that even the first page of brachot, like the first question the rabbis ask is, well, why are we starting here? Like, what is this based on, right? Like, what else has come before that we're basing this on? So there's no real beginning. Right. Every tractate of Talmud famously begins on page 2, right? Because there is no really page 1. I mean, that's really a printing history issue, but it's symbolic
Right.
also. Anyway, so yeah, so I didn't start in the beginning, but I am in my second cycle, and that's part of what's been so fascinating. Sort of when I learn, I use the same volumes of Talmud that I used the first time I learned, and I took a
Wow.
lot of notes. So I'm always going back to my notes and sort of a lot of times the same lines and ideas, concepts, phrases that struck me 7.5 years ago strike me again now and speak to me, but sometimes speak to me in different ways and
When
mean
you say
different things.
notes, do you mean, you don't mean necessarily, it could be your journal thoughts. Meaning you had mentioned that you kind of used, I think you mentioned in the book how a lot of the book comes from these thoughts. So it was something that
Yeah,
resonated with you personally, and you would write that in your
yeah,
Talmud.
yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I take notes in all the margins of my Gemara, like very, very copious notes, like everything from vocabulary words, phrases that really speak to me. Um, um, I can just tell you from today. Okay, we're learning Eruvi now. Maybe I'm sure there's some Daf Yomi learners out there. So there's this concept that came up. I don't know if I'm a few days ahead, a few days behind. I'm never exactly on the Daf, but definitely in the right parak. So we're in the 4th chapter of Eruvin, and there's this idea of a chamar gamal, which is someone who's kind of pulled in 2 directions because of the distance they're allowed to walk on Shabbat. Chamar gamal literally means a donkey and a camel, and one of those animals is led from the front and one of those animals is led from the back, which means you can't really lead both those animals at once. And all day today my kids are like, Ema, help me, Ema, help with this, Ema, help with that. And I was like, it's a chamar gamal, like I'm being pulled in both directions and I just can't move, like I can't go anywhere with that. So I
Wow.
definitely, that is to say, like, this is the thought from today. I just gave you a random example
Yeah.
from this morning. But I always, the Talmud is always furnishing with metaphors. Now the Chamar Gamal image spoke to me also 7.5 years ago because I underlined it, and I don't know what I'm sure I probably wrote something about it. I don't know, but it certainly didn't speak to me because it was about trying to do Zoom
Children.
school with little kids. That was not my reality 7.5 years ago. So there's that. And I
Wow.
often, like, my husband and I, we joke that we had like our Daf Yomi anniversary because we both taught the Daf at our wedding, so we remembered like Bava Batra Samech, that was the Daf at our wedding, so we had, that day was significant. Recently, my twin daughters are they're almost, well, now they're a little over 7.5, but on their 7.5 birthday, that was also a Daf Yomi anniversary because I remembered the Daf I learned when they were born. So in a way, it becomes kind of like this, a way of measuring time, and the second cycle in that way has a lot of added resonance.
So I think the double-sided question is how did you keep up giving birth to children and life and having a job and all of these incredibly time-consuming things? And I think on the other hand, were there ever moments where it felt like a burden? Because it's every day and it's a lot of time. And if you want to really
Yeah.
understand it, it takes time.
Um, um, okay, so I think the way that I kept up, I'll give you 2 answers that sort of contradict each other, I guess. One is like tremendous determination, and prioritizing the daf. Like, it was the thing that I had to do. Other things could wait. Like, even other things that other people would think of as like much more important, like taking a shower, for example. Like I would prioritize learning the daf above everything else. Like, I couldn't get through the day. And in the early years when I learned, I used to carry my volume of Talmud with me everywhere I went. And some Masechtot are really heavy. And, I carried a backpack everywhere. And I really felt that burden. Like, you asked about a burden, right? On my back, I felt it. Because I wouldn't, and if I learned first thing in the morning, then I didn't have to carry it with me. That was sort of my deal with myself. So I definitely felt the weight of the obligation on me at all times. Was it ever burdensome? I don't think I ever felt it as a burden. I really like daily commitments. I find it very hard to break, to sort of break off things once I've committed to them, whatever it is, whether it's exercise or or also bad habits. Like once I get into something, I don't stop, for good and for bad. So some of it was that, and then but the other half of it also, I think the other side of it is sort of a willingness to be flexible about what it meant to learn the day's page of Talmud. I'm thinking of there's a famous line from the tractate Ta'anit, which is about fasting in times of rain, where the rabbis say, Le'olam yeh adam rach kekaneh ve'al yeh kasheh ke'erez, that a person should always be pliable like a reed, and not what's the word, like hard and unyielding like a cedar tree. And I took that statement very much to heart, in the sense that, what, like, if you're a reed, then a big wind comes, and okay, you're a reed. You bend over in the breeze, and then you straighten back up when the breeze passes. But a cedar tree, once it gets knocked over, you can never, replant that tree, right? So, or regraft that tree. So that is to say, I was very flexible with myself about what it meant to learn, and there were periods in my life when learning the daf meant listening to a podcast and trying to follow along if I could. Sometimes it meant listening to a podcast while I was running. Like sometimes it meant sitting with the Gemara, reading the Gemara, then reading Rashi, then reading Steinsaltz, like different commentaries, right? Sometimes I would try to read academic articles that pertain to the sugyot, the passages of Talmud I was learning. So there was a lot of variation in terms of, I tried to be realistic about what I could do at any point. I remember the first time I switched to podcast was really hard for me. It was really hard for me to accept that, like, that was enough and that could count. But if I hadn't done that, it was right after my twins were born. Like, if I hadn't done that, there was no way I would have been able to continue. Like, it would have just been impossible. I never had two hands. I just didn't have two hands to hold the Gemara. And now what I've been doing now I try, like, I'm always a few days ahead reading the daf. I read the daf and then I listen to a podcast, but I'm usually a few days behind with listening. So speaking of the Chamar Gamal, I'm never exactly on the daf. I'm always being pulled ahead and behind. So it's funny because my friends, I have a lot of friends who live in the daf, and they'll often text me like jokes or comments, and I'm always like, okay, that was 3 days ago, and it will be another 3 days. I'm never exactly in the right place. So I'm always, in a way that also keeps me on target, because I am part of a community of learners too. So it was very hard for me to let go. So I have a friend who jokes that daf yomi is kind of like, he says it's like he said he's a man, so he said it's like the bad girlfriend that you should break up with, but you're kind of just like really stuck in that relationship. And I identify with that too. Sometimes there have been times when I've said to myself, like, if I weren't so committed to daf yomi, I could do so much other learning, but I just can't get over this addiction,
Wow. Are there particular podcasts that you like?
So I generally listen now.
Oh, hold on. Can everyone hear?
She muted herself.
You got asked to unmute. Hold on.
Sorry about that. Is that
you're
better?
Good.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't
you're
mean
good.
Okay. So I've listened to different podcasts over time. But when I started, the only podcast I knew, my Hebrew wasn't good enough when I first started to listen in Hebrew. I've always learned only with Hebrew Gemara, like with Steinsaltz, like as in a Hebrew commentary on the original. Wow. But in the beginning, my Hebrew wasn't quite good enough to listen to Hebrew podcasts. So when I started, the only podcasts I could find in English were from YU. So they were very yeshivish. I started with those. But over time, I found others. Now I listen to Michelle Farber has a podcast called Daf Yomi for Women, which is excellent. It's not really for women. I wish she changed the name, but it's excellent because it very much sticks to the pshat of the Gemara. Like, it's just a simple reading of exactly what's on the daf. Using Rashi as helpful. But really trying to just understand on the most simplistic level, like, what are the issues at stake? What are the various positions? How are they justified? You just get the lay of the land very quickly. Every podcast is about maybe 40, 45 minutes. And I learn the daf first. So I do that kind of as a way of reviewing. So I always do that while I'm doing something else. And I've learned over time what I can do.
I'm going to put it into the chat so everyone can, Michelle Farber.
Oh yeah.
If you Google that.
Yeah.
And what was your connection? Because you just talked about how maybe you could learn other things. What was your connection or experience with Jewish text prior to Daf Yomi?
So I had started when I went to a Jewish day school through the 8th grade. I went to a Salman Schechter school. So I had learned, Tanakh, I had learned Mishnah, never any Talmud. At that point, I went to public school in 9th grade. So I didn't, continue like serious Jewish education after that. But you know, I grew up in a traditional home. My father's a rabbi, a conservative rabbi. We, you know, my family was Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kashrut, you know, Shomer Mitzvah, like, you know, like the Jewish world, world of Jewish ritual observance was very, not just familiar to me, but like part and parcel of my being from the outset. So, so the world of halakha was not foreign to me, but I had never really learned. I'd never studied halakha, certainly, and never studied Talmud in any serious way. I would say like the most I had done was, you know, getting a source sheet and, you know, with various like little passages cut and pasted onto a source sheet. I'd never learned Talmud in context, certainly. So that was part of the joy for me of beginning Daf Yomi, was studying some sources that I'd seen many times before in my life, but never in context, and discovering that in context they mean different things. They speak to me in different ways. Yeah, so that was part of the fun.
Do you feel like Daf Yomi can be for anyone?
You know, that reminds me of the question, like, can anyone run a marathon? You know, and they say
Right.
that anyone can run a marathon. Like they say that like no matter how, I don't know, like how poor your fitness is or whatever, like if you train, you too can run a marathon. You know, people say that, you know, and I have friends that you would look at them and never think they'd run a marathon, and lo and behold, they can do it. So, so yes, I think anyone could do it. However, part of the reason that's the case is because just like you can run a marathon, like in like, you know, at the pace of the tortoise or the pace of the hare or whatever, you know, with Daf Yomi, you can learn on so many different levels, right? Like the world of Jewish learning is famously compared to an ocean, right? Yam halacha, right? The sea of halacha, the sea of Jewish law. And as with any sea, any ocean, right? You can swim in the ocean on many different levels, right? You can skim the surface, right? You can swim underwater and get a little deeper. Or you can become a deep sea diver and get to know all the flora and fauna on the ocean floor, right? And that's a very different way of studying Talmud. So I think that's true of Daf Yomi too, that, you know, it depends on how much time you want to put into it, how much knowledge you bring to bear, you know, how many other sources you're looking at. Anyone can do it, but I think what you get out of it is very much correlates with how much you're willing to and can put into it, I would say.
Yeah, again, I just, if anyone hasn't read the book, it's such a, it shows you how it can resonate in ways that are not necessarily connected to halacha or to even Jewish context, but just different life experiences. I'm also just, if anyone hasn't read it, it is, it's quite inspiring, even if you haven't learned Gemara or Talmud before. If in the book you talk, I mean, you work in publishing and editing and writing, you talk a lot about poetry and all of the different wonderful works of literature. Does the Talmud fit into that for you, or does it do something different for you than English literature?
So, you know, I've always been a very interdisciplinary learner, always trying to make connections between what I'm learning in one setting, what I'm learning in another setting. When I was in high school, I used to write poetry about math, and, you know, just sort of in a way to remember like the order of operations, or I was always coming up with mnemonics and little poems. I studied in college, I majored in history of science, which was basically like the only way I could find to do sciences and humanities, you know, both. So that is to say, I'm always bringing what I'm learning in one discipline to bear on what I'm learning in another discipline. So when I began learning Talmud, that was no different. I've read, I love English literature. Spent much of my life reading poetry and English literature. And so when I studied Talmud, I heard echoes of the other literatures that I loved as I was learning. So I don't know, I'd be reading about, like, you know, all these strange, like, witch-like techniques to cure leprosy. And I thought, you know, all these things, strange ingredients you have to stir in a cauldron. I was like, oh, this reminds me of the cauldron scene in Macbeth. And like, I started reading that, you know, as a kind of cauldron scene. And it really is very similar. But anyway, so I you know, there's something different about Daf Yomi in the sense that I definitely regard it as a sacred text. you know, like I'll, especially this, you know, it's so much a part of my life that I'll learn Daf Yomi, like no matter what else I'm doing. And when I'm listening to podcasts, which I'm often doing, like I sort of think of Daf Yomi as the soundtrack to my life. So it's always sort of playing in the background very often. And I've had moments where I have to remind myself, like, you have to turn off the shear before you go into the bathroom to brush your teeth, you know, like, as in like, this is not appropriate, right? Like, this is Kodesh, you know? So I definitely regard it as something that has sanctity to it. And in a way, I think about Daf Yomi a lot like the way I think about davening, or maybe I should say a lot the way I think many people think about davening, as something that you just have to kind of like check off the list and do every day. And some days it's meaningful, some days it's not, you never know, but you just have to do it every day. And the day can't really start until you do it. So it's, in a way, for me, it's become sort of ritualized in that way. It's something that I do because of who I am, because of a commitment that I've made. So wait, now I'm sorry, I forgot what the question was.
Well, you answered it. We're talking about English literature and Daf Yomi.
Oh yeah, literature. Yeah. So I do think of it as holy, and therefore different, but all the literatures I read are always, you know, literary references are always creeping up in my head as I'm learning.
Right. Rabbi Gelman, you said you had a question.
I did.
There you go.
Thank you, Ilana, for doing this program for us. This is great.
Thank you.
I've started Daf Yomi, I don't know how many times, but definitely gotten. You mentioned to me about something earlier. You mentioned that whenever you thought about Daf Yomi, you always wonder what other things you could learn. So someone once told me that Daf Yomi is like the para aduma. It's Natame HaTehorim and Natame and Natayr HaTameim. People who don't learn at all, they learn, but people who could be learning, let's say, Be'iyun, and they end up doing Daf Yomi. So I'm wondering if after this, you're almost done with your second cycle, are you planning on doing a third cycle? Do you learn a little deeper each time? What's your learning? How has Daf Yomi affected your next learning project?
So I wish I were more intentional. I sort of feel like it's hard for me to stop. I think the main reason hard to stop is because there's a community out there of learners. I think of Daf Yomi as like a treadmill. Like the cycle continues. The cycle it's been running. This treadmill has been on since 1923, right? Every day with no exception. No, you don't stop for Shabbat. You don't stop for Yom Kippur, right? You don't stop for Tisha B'Av, you know, more relevantly, right? Every day you have to learn a daf. You have to learn a page of Talmud. And once you stop, like you kind of fall out of that community. And so it's very hard for me to let go of that, to let go of so I don't know if I would ever, it's hard for me to imagine stopping is, I guess, the first thing I'll say. Very hard. Also because like, I'll stop getting all the jokes that my friends write me. Like that's really my world, you know? Like I'll feel like it's like the fear of missing out, you know? But I do think I go deeper every cycle. And I also teach. I teach rabbinic Agadah, and my teaching always draws on my Daf Yomi learning. So I think the teaching very much is sort of my opportunity to revisit sources that spoke to me in Daf Yomi. Like I just did a series for Elul on the Agadot at the beginning of Masechet Avodah Zarah, a lot of which deal with the Avodah Zarah as the tractate about idolatry, but discursive as the Talmud is, right? There are a lot of stories relating to themes of judgment and repentance. So I taught several of those Agadot this past month. And that very much came from like someone asked me, what would you like to teach? We want you to do a series. And I just thought to myself, what would be relevant? And because of Daf Yomi, like I sort of just like, that's what came to mind. And then I spent a lot of time getting to know those sources much more deeply than I did when I ever did them in Daf Yomi. So the teaching is helpful. I'm also working now on a project to write a Dvar Torah for every Parsha that it's called the Talmud and the Parsha, where I use one sugya as an intertext for discussing, for giving a Dvar Torah, something related to the Parsha. So that's also an opportunity to go in a bit more depth. And again, a lot of those ideas come from just remembering, like one of the, we talked before about how I write a lot of notes in the Gemara. One of the things I write all the time in my Gemara, I write on the bottom of the pages, like, Drasha la Parshat Breshit, Drasha la Parshat Lech Lecha, whatever. Like, I'll think about, where I get a good Divrei Torah ideas based on what I'm learning, and I have a lot of notes like that. I wish they were searchable because they're all in pencil. It's not very searchable. It's not searchable. So I'm often flipping through, like, I'll sit there, like, I'm so old-fashioned. It's pathetic, but I'll go through every page. Like, I know there was something in Yevamot. I know, where was it? Literally going through, like, 100-something pages to try to find that's by Torah, but so that's another opportunity to revisit. I've done various. Last year I did a chavruta on Agadot in the Yerushalmi, which was a way of just sort of broadening my learning beyond the Bavli. I've done different. I did a chavruta on the Torah Tamima last year. I guess I could say I've looked at the Gemara from many different angles over time, and all of those have been somewhat in more depth. I do feel like the nature of my life right now is such that I don't have, or I don't know. I guess we all make choices, but I have not found a way of being able to learn Biyun the way I would ideally want to do that right now with young kids and work and life. It just hasn't happened. Daf Yomi is something that I know I can manage every day and that I get something different out of every time. It's not the same every year. Like, people say to me, like, why would you do another cycle? And I say, well, why would you read the same Parshiot again? Didn't you just read them last year? Right? But of course, like, Parshiot speak to us in different ways, right? You just told me that you're having a big flood in Houston. I would say, Ya'arov Kamatar Likhi, which is this week's Parsha. I'm just saying, I'm making that up, but I'm just saying, as in, like, you hear lines from the Parsha differently when you're, depending on what you're going through at that time in your life. And this Daf Yomi is no different. Long answer.
I have a couple more questions answering people on about about Daf Yomi, but we have about 10 minutes left. I do want to address the book a little. Why did you decide to write a memoir? And also someone had asked about the publishing process and how that happened.
Yeah. So I didn't really ever decide to write a memoir. When I had no more space in the margins to write my notes, I started keeping a blog, an anonymous blog under a pseudonym that a friend made for me, just as sort of a repository for my writings. And as I was about to complete my first cycle, a friend said to me, "Oh my gosh, you're going to finish Daf Yomi. What are you going to do to celebrate?" And I thought, "Oh, I don't know. I didn't think about that." And she said, "Well, you've been writing all this stuff. You should, like, put it together in some way so you have a record." And I thought, that's a great idea. I should do that. And I started sort of I had opened a new file, like a new Word document, and I just called it, like, I don't remember what I called it, like blog contents or whatever. And I just said, let me make a list of everything I've written. And I had learned tractate by tractate. So I realized that for every tractate, I had a bunch of essays, and all those essays connected because they were all about what I was going through at that time. So I kind of looked at it and said, wow, I basically have, like, an outline for a book here where every chapter is another tractate of the Talmud. So that's how it began. I wrote it initially really for myself as a sort of way of marking the end of my first cycle. I work in book publishing, as you said, Ruthie, and I finished the manuscript, and it sat for about at least a year, maybe 2 years. Actually, it couldn't have been more, because I remember one Pesach, I thought to myself, do I dare send this to my boss, who's a literary agent? And I thought, oh, I think I can improve it a little more. And I remember the next Pesach going through the same anxious question, should I show this to my boss? So that's pathetic, but it was at least a year that it sat in, like, the proverbial drawer. It took a very long time for me to show it to anyone. When I finally did show it to someone, I ended up showing it to my boss's husband, and he really liked it, and sort of went from there. The book didn't really change at all from the time I wrote it to the time it was published. Two friends went through it for me. One from a more literary, just to make comments about the writing style, and one, my chavruta, went through it to check for errors. But found a lot and helped me out a lot. I'm sure they'll continue to find more. But aside from that, it really, like, it was all finished and basically in the same format. When I got comments back from the editor, they were very minimal, and they were sort of on the level of, like, she wrote me, "You have this line, when a man divorces his wife, we need to make the language more gender equal when one spouse divorces the other." And I was like, actually, in Judaism, that's not how it works. So no, I can explain why I can't say that, but I can't say that, So there weren't many changes. It did take a long time to find a publisher, though. A lot of publishers wrote back saying, this is so beautifully written. I can't think of anyone who would read it though. I got a lot of responses like that, like who would be the audience for this kind of book? And the editor who ended up buying it is not Jewish, and has no background really in Jewish texts, and really just liked the writing and liked this idea of this idea of people all around the world studying the same holy texts. That's how it began. And she's the one who bought the book, and I'll never forget. She bought the book the day my daughter was born, and my agent called when I was in the delivery room having my baby, and the phone rang, and I said to my husband, "We have to get it. It's Deborah." And he was like, "We can't get it. You're in labor." And then I said, "We have to." And he said to me, "Ilana, I know that people often analogize like having a book to having a baby, but you can't do both at the same time." So I'll always remember when the book was bought. And my daughter's now 4.5, so there you go.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Anyway.
Wow. Staying busy. So you had mentioned about the get. So I did have this question. So the Talmud is, written or compiled 2,000 years ago. So the attitudes towards genders and gender roles was very different. So I wanted to ask you about how you related to that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm very lucky because I grew up in such an egalitarian home that I never really had any hangups about gender. My father is a rabbi now he's retired, but for 30 years was a rabbi of the same shul. A fully egalitarian shul, was fully egalitarian when he got there, which is unusual, but the case already. And I went to a conservative Jewish day school. I really grew up believing that women could do everything that men could do, and that women's roles were more or less equivalent to men's roles. Not just in the political sphere and the business world, but in the ritual world and the Jewish world as well. So I didn't really unlike many other people who learned Daf Yomi, I didn't really come to it with any sort of chip on my shoulder.
But even not a chip, there were women in the community who started learning Daf Yomi, and we ended up having an 1.5-hour long Zoom session because they were reading some of the beginning passages that are certainly in a modern sense, and it's hard for us to even think of it 2,000 years ago, how it still is not incredibly not offensive to women. So even without a chip, just to relate to those passages and how.
So when I came to passages like that, I thought to myself, wow, it was so different to be a woman 2,000 years ago than it is today. It's almost like the women 2,000 years ago were a different species. And I'm so happy that species has, in the developed world at least, become extinct, because I really like the way women are today. That was sort of it was like, look at those dinosaurs. It must have been really hard to be a dinosaur, but I'm not a dinosaur, right? Yes, Nashim, right? There's a whole Seder, right? There's a whole order of the Talmud that's about, at least a name, like women's experiences, women's bodies, women's experiences of marriage, of divorce, purity, impurity, what have you, right? That I learned that whole Seder, and I thought to myself, like, it wasn't like, it wasn't an attack on me, because I really felt a discontinuity between myself and the women I was encountering in the Talmud, and what I took away from the experience of learning Talmud was not a sense of sort of outrage or umbrage in any way. It was more a sense of like tremendous relief and gratitude that I am a Jewish woman living today. Like, Baruch Shasani Isha, like now, like what a miracle that I really feel like very, very, very blessed that I have the opportunity to both birth a child and learn Shas. Like, that seems really, really, really lucky, because for most of Jewish history, like, that has not been the case for women, for people, like there haven't been beings like that who could do that. And I feel like because I can have both of those experiences, I'm going to read texts in a very different way than people who don't have that experience. And my metaphors are different. My associations are different. I think of pregnancy as the most spiritual times of my life. When do we become more like God than when we're bearing life inside us and creating life? and nurturing life. Like for me, that was just like, it was always such a profound experience. And I felt like it enabled me to reach insights that I never would have been able to reach had I not had that experience. And that overlap between being able to carry a child inside me and learn Gemara, like that just felt like such it was like the total eclipse of the sun that I could do both of these things in a way, you know? So I really just constantly felt very, very, I'm not trying to be like Pollyannish about it. Like I really, really felt very lucky. And the women in the Talmud, like, didn't upset me, offend me. It was more like, wow, life was really hard for them. And boy, am I lucky that I could live for 10 years in neither my father's house nor my husband's house and be perfectly fine, you know, etc.
Right. Beautiful. As we finish up, I just want to open the floor. If anyone has questions, you can either raise your hand or send them in on the chat or text me. We do have a question. Someone wanted to know if you learn Nach Yomi because they're learning Daf Yomi and they feel incredible guilt if they miss Nach Yomi, and they feel incredible guilt when they miss a day or trying to catch up. So she wanted to know if you learn Nach Yomi and if you have advice about that.
No, I never have. I never have. There was a brief period when I was like in my 20s when I tried to read a parak of Navi a day with a friend, but it didn't last very long. I have a really, 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 really hard time. I'm very good about anything that we lane, but anything we don't lane, I really don't remember. And the nice thing about Gemara is there's a lot of repetition. Both concepts, sugyot reappear, you know, sometimes with variations, but you know, the chazara is built into the learning because many sugyot come up again and again. And I don't, maybe some people would say that's true of learning Nach, you know, maybe Divrei Yamim, but I don't find that to be the case, and I forget so quickly. My knowledge of everything past Shmuel Aleph, which is when I finished 8th grade, like where we were, is really, really sad, to be honest. I've learned a little more by looking up sources when I'm learning Gemara, but yeah, I never have. Maybe someday I will. I like the discourse of the Gemara a lot. It really speaks to my literary sensibility. And Tanakh, you know, there are passages of Tanakh that I love, but it's mostly, I don't know if it's fair to say, like it's mostly the parts that I've studied already. So I feel, I don't know, so maybe someday.
We have a question that everyone can see in the chat. What suggestions would you give for a teenage girl who is struggling with the role of women in the Torah in terms of what she can learn or any other ideas?
Yeah, I would say like take a historical perspective and look at how different what women can do today is from what women could do 50 years ago, you know, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Like, I see that women have had more and more opportunities to grow spiritually and intellectually in our tradition, and I feel really grateful for that. I feel like we're heading in the right direction, and I think that the insights that women are able to offer are profound and unprecedented and revolutionary, and that's something very exciting. I really deeply believe that the more people that study the texts of our tradition, the more insights into those texts we will glean, the more deeply we will understand those texts, or the more faces of Torah we will reveal. And I just feel very, very fortunate that we all merit to be part of that unfolding revelation.
Oh, I just got chills. I just want to be conscious of your time. Okay, I think that's all the questions for now. I obviously have like 20 more questions, but I'll reserve that for the next time I ask you for a conversation with the author. Ilana, thank you so much. Someone told me privately that your love of learning is contagious. So this was really, really inspiring, and especially before Yom Kippur, to see such a personal and passionate connection with the Torah is really awesome to see.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And Gmar Chatima Tova.
Thank you to you too. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll keep you posted on the next few authors and conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, Ilana. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.